Of all ancient civilizations, Egypt has left behind the greatest legacy of sacred sites. The mighty pyramids, the majestic temples of Karnak and Luxor, and the shadowy tombs of the Valley of the Kings are among its greatest monuments. All of these sites evoke a powerful reality. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with death and the afterlife. They mummified the bodies of the dead, preparing them to face the fearsome journey into the underworld. On papyrus rolls and tomb walls, they recorded the spells that would help the dead survive this journey. This collection of prayers and incantations is known as the Book of the Dead. But this seeming obsession with death could mask a more subtle reality. In 2015, a researcher discovered a unique artifact at the Cairo Museum, a 4,000-year-old leather roll.
This leather roll opens like a window for us for a new part of Egypt we didn't know.
This incredibly rare manuscript reveals the origins of the Book of the Dead. It could change everything we thought we knew about religion in ancient Egypt. For 3,000 years, Egypt was the most advanced civilization on the planet. Its legacy of art and culture includes some of the world's most famous and mysterious sacred sites. Many of these monuments were inspired by the desire to prepare for life after death.
The ancient Egyptians essentially existed for the afterlife. They lived in houses made of mud brick, unfired mud brick. Even the king lived in a palace made of unfired mud brick. But yet you look at their funerary monuments and they're all made of stone, high quality stone. And the minute the king became king, his workmen started working on his tomb immediately.
But in 2015, a new discovery undermines centuries of Egyptology. Hidden for 4,000 years, it reveals the secret origins of Egypt's most famous religious text. This document rewrites the history of the Book of the Dead. And it reveals that Egypt's sacred sites may tell us as much about the living as they do about the dead. Here at Giza, on the outskirts of Cairo, stands the most famous of all these sites, the last surviving wonder of the ancient world, the Pyramids of Giza. The pyramids are guarded by the impassive Sphinx, known in Arabic as the Father of Terror. It exudes this awful majesty because its face is that of a pharaoh, Khafra. The pyramids were built for Khafra and two other pharaohs some 4,500 years ago. To this day, they bear the names of these great kings of Egypt. Menkaura, the smallest of the three, but still a massive structure. Khafra, its peak snow-capped with limestone. And the titanic Khufu, the Great Pyramid itself. Weighing almost 6 million tons, the Great Pyramid was one of the most gigantic buildings ever erected. It was originally covered with slabs of polished limestone, representing the descending rays of the sun.
When the Egyptians began to build the pyramid, they located a square and they cut in the solid rock. And they made the base of the pyramid to be 9 meters high of solid rock, no stones.
Using mortar made from mud and clay, an army of workers spent decades building the pyramids. They were not slaves, but free men, skilled laborers, who used simple materials like wood and rope in the construction process. For the Great Pyramid alone, they assembled 2.3 million finely cut limestone blocks. The pyramids are not just magnificent structures. They are also tombs. Deep within the Great Pyramid lies the King's Chamber, said to be the burial room of the pharaoh Khufu. From this chamber, two shafts slice through the colossal stonework like ancient skylights.
The mysterious tunnels in the pyramid. People, they call it air shafts. They are not shafts for air.
The shafts speed the king's ritual ascent into the heavens, because the pyramids and pharaohs were a link between the people and their gods. To guide the dead through the afterlife, the Egyptians compiled a great collection of prayers and spells. They wrote them down on the floorboards of coffins, on tomb walls, and on papyrus. Around 1,000 years after the pyramids were built, Egypt entered its golden age, a great era known as the New Kingdom, roughly 1600 to 1100 BC. The awe-inspiring Temple of Karnak was constructed at this time. It was a statement of intent by the New Kingdom pharaohs, reflecting their power and majesty. During this time, the Egyptians refined the afterlife spells into a collection of some 200 incantations. Many centuries later, archaeologists discovered these spells in the tombs of the New Kingdom pharaohs, hundreds of miles south of Giza. Today, they are known as the Book of the Dead.
The ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, the ancient title is actually the Book of Going Forth by Day, was to provide a guide for the soul of the deceased. So to go forth by day is to actually have your soul leave the tomb and return to the body at night.
What is called Book of the Dead are actually lots of spells were grouped and put mainly on papyrus. And this papyrus will be normally rolled and put with the funeral equipment of the deceased. It contains lots of important spell that gives the deceased magical power in the hereafter.
No two books of the dead were the same, and yet they all shared the same account of a great journey through a mysterious realm, peopled with gods and monsters. On the west bank of the Nile, opposite the ancient city of Thebes, lies one of the most famous sacred sites in the world, the great necropolis of the Valley of the Kings. This place is a who's who of ancient Egyptian royalty. During the glorious New Kingdom era, virtually every Egyptian pharaoh was buried here. Ramses II, Seti I, and the famous Tutankhamun all had their tombs in this renowned cemetery. Even in ancient times, it was a tourist attraction for Greeks, Romans, and others. The warrior Pharaoh Seti I, who reigned over 1,200 years before the birth of Christ, was one of the greatest of all Egypt's kings. His is one of the most remarkable tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The tomb walls are decorated with scenes from the incredible journey through the afterlife described in the Book of the Dead. The walls crawl with extraordinary scenes and creatures, snakes with swords, animal-headed gods, winged goddesses. To modern eyes, the images seem strange and fantastical. But for the ancient Egyptians, they were part of the afterlife, a universe that was very real. But before the dead could embark on this voyage into the unknown, they had to be prepared. Their bodies had to undergo an incredible transformation and an amazing ceremony to ensure survival in the land of the dead. The journey began with an extraordinary transformation. A ritual thousands of years older than the Great Pyramids themselves. Mummification.
The Egyptians employed mummification to preserve the body essentially as a resting place for the soul. There are certain exceptions to the rule of mummification. If you drowned in the Nile, it's actually an express way to the underworld, and you are considered to be a blessed dead.
Over thousands of years, the Egyptians perfected the fine art of preserving the dead. To keep the body from decaying, priests carefully removed the internal organs through a slit in the abdomen. The deceased needed these organs for the afterlife. They had to be protected. These 4 porcelain vessels, discovered in the tomb of Tutankhamun, contain the young pharaoh's lungs, stomach, intestines, and liver. They are called canopic jars, each one guarded by one of the 4 sons of Horus, the god of kingship. There was one organ that did not receive this special treatment. The ancient Egyptians saw the brain as a source of putrefaction.
They did not believe that the brain was significant in the afterlife, and it was actually removed via a hook that would be inserted through the nose, and essentially the brain would be liquefied with that metal hook and then would come out through the nose.
Finally, the priests encased the mummy in a sort of papier-mâché made from linen or papyrus. They molded it to fit the shape of the face and body. After mummification, it was time for the funeral and the final ceremonies to prepare the deceased for the hereafter. In the Theban necropolis near Luxor, a fascinating but little-known tomb depicts an ancient Egyptian funeral in vibrant detail. Discovered almost a century ago, for many years this sacred site remained closed. In November 2015, the Egyptian government opened it to the public for the first time. Its sheer brilliance is breathtaking. These wall paintings are over 3,000 years old, and yet they are as vivid as if done yesterday. This tomb belonged to an Egyptian priest. These are scenes from his funeral.
It shows scenes of royal ancestor worship. We see them on every single wall in this tomb. They appear as statues being dragged on sledges. We also see scenes from the funeral, professional mourning women.
All ancient Egyptian funerals culminated in an extraordinary ritual. A magical tool was applied to the mouth and face of the mummy. This was known as the opening of the mouth. It restored the deceased's senses, giving them ability to see, breathe, and speak in the afterlife.
The opening of the mouth ritual restored to the deceased all living functions. You would eat, you would drink, you would engage in sexual activity. Anything you enjoyed in this life, you could continue in the afterlife.
There's been some debates among Egyptologists as to whether it was enacted on the mummy or the statue, but in reality, it doesn't really matter, because if the statue had the name of the deceased, then that was considered to be a physical manifestation of the deceased.
For many years, Egyptologists thought that the opening of the mouth was simply a symbolic ceremony. But new evidence shows that before it took place, another procedure was carried out directly on the corpse of the deceased. It was extremely physical. Not a ceremonial touch with a magic wand, but a violent, forceful attack. Professor Frank Ruheli is the head of the Swiss Mummy Project, which uses state-of-the-art scientific methods to investigate ancient human mummies. Professor Ruheli has examined around 100 skulls from Egyptian mummies. He has found that during mummification, the priests literally smashed open the mummy's mouth and jaw, using tools specially designed for this gruesome purpose.
We definitely have some sort of physical damage or physical approach as part of this whole embalming treatment for the oral cavity. So it's not only a ritual mouth opening, but it's actually a physical mouth opening procedure. You see different levels. Here we have a bit less soft tissue. Again, you see the lesion in the frontal lower part of the mummy, and you basically can imagine that that must have been a forceful opening as part of the whole embalming procedure. In some cases, we found, for example, embalming material like the bitumen, the black sort of material on top of the broken teeth, which is the best indicator that this is something which actually happened during the process of embalming. And you can clearly see on these virtual images that you can look from any side at the mummy. You can take the soft tissues away. Here we basically just see the bone and the teeth left, which makes it easier to see the lesions, for example. So we clearly see the damage, the physical damage, and we see the dislocation of some of these teeth.
The teeth were knocked out of place, evidence of a particularly forceful process.
These teeth must have been put there after the embalming, otherwise they would have been washed away and gone into the lungs or into the stomach. So obviously they broke some teeth, sometimes they gave back some teeth because they wanted to have the full body being complete.
The new evidence proves that funeral practices could be quite violent, but for the Egyptians, this was essential so that the dead could function physically in the afterlife just as they did in this life.
So obviously, at least in some cases, there have been two procedures during the whole mummification process. First, the more physical one, where they really, with some sort of chisels, opened actually the mouth, which was sort of dried out. And then there was obviously a second symbolic treatment later on, which was just by sort of touching the fully wrapped mummy at the end of the whole process.
Opening the mouth was critical. The dead needed the power of speech so they could recite the spells of the Book of the Dead. Only by uttering these spells aloud could they regain their powers in the afterlife. Because they were now about to join the sun god Re on his fantastic voyage into the underworld. To survive it, they needed the help of the Book of the Dead. Every year, this remarkable otherworldly journey was enacted symbolically at one of Egypt's greatest sacred sites. On the east bank of the Nile, near the city of Luxor, stands the majestic Temple of Karnak. This sanctuary was dedicated to the mightiest of all Egypt's deities. Amun-Re was an all-powerful combination of Amun, the king of the gods, and the sun god Re. Karnak was built to glorify him. Karnak is the largest temple complex in the world, a vast 200-acre sacred site, almost double the size of the Vatican. Work on the main complex started in the New Kingdom era under the pharaoh Thutmose I. Later kings greatly expanded the site, including the warrior pharaoh Seti I and his son Ramses II. These wall reliefs show the pharaoh smiting his enemies. Ancient Egyptians saw Karnak as a bridge between this world and the cosmic realm. Because here, man became God. When a person died, they would become one with Osiris, the god of the underworld.
Just like Osiris, the king of the dead and the dead god, was resurrected by Isis, the deceased wanted to become Osiris so that they could have an afterlife, could be resurrected, could live again to have an eternal life.
The afterlife mirrored the setting of the sun. Every night, the sun god Re died in the west. During the 12 hours of the night, he undertook the journey through the underworld.
And the image, what is actually, is what is in the netherworld. It is the trip of the ancient Egyptian god Re in his boat to the afterlife.
Every year, the people of Karnak held a living reenactment of this journey, traveling along the Nile to another superb sanctuary, the Temple of Luxor. After Karnak, this is the second great temple of the Nile's east bank. It was built to celebrate the end of the sun god's journey. Here, he was reborn as the rising sun. This symbolized the sun god's voyage through the underworld. Everyone who died would join him on this fantastic journey. The ancient necropolis of Saqqara near Cairo was not just a burial place for humans. As symbols of the gods, animals offered protection to the human soul in the underworld, and like humans, they were ritually mummified. Near the Great Step Pyramid lies the entrance to a subterranean labyrinth, the Catacomb of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead. Over the last few years, an archaeological team has explored every inch of this great catacomb, discovering the remains of some 8 million animals, mostly dogs. But there were also jackals, foxes, falcons, cats, and mongoose. Animal mummies were representations of the gods. This mummified baboon represents Ta'ot, the god of the moon, who is present at the judgment of the dead. The mummified ram symbolizes Amun, the king of the gods, who protected the dead on their travels through the underworld. The dead needed all the protection they could get, because the realm they were about to enter was a strange and terrifying place. The underworld is powerfully visualized on the tomb walls of the Valley of the Kings. Here, the dead would encounter strange creatures, the demons, who populated the 12 hours of the night. They shaped the destinies of the living as well as the dead.
For the Egyptians, the ability of the soul to get to the other side is just one of a number of passages that they foresee.
The Book of the Dead, a great collection of spells and prayers, offered a way to survive this perilous underworld. The guardians and gates of the afterlife are depicted in terrifying detail on the tomb walls of long-dead pharaohs. Deep in the Valley of the Kings lies the tomb of the New Kingdom pharaoh, Ramses VI. Its walls are adorned with stunning and atmospheric scenes.
It is represented in the tomb of Ramses VI. It is like a papyri, a complete papyri depicted in the tomb. And actually it tells us about the trip of the sun god. But now he's not in a boat. He's not going in a boat. When the sun will go through darkness and will see all the difficulties inside. The vision of the ancient Egyptian imagined the 12 hours of the night when the sun sits and reborn again. And that is really a beautiful vision of the ancient Egyptian to the afterlife.
These images and hieroglyphs describe a sinister landscape where the sun god interacts with the inhabitants of 6 great underworld caves. Among them are creatures called slaughterers who slay the unrighteous. Egyptian demons were the supernatural guardians of the underworld. They could be good or bad, and the dead could only hope to pass through the gates they guarded by possessing special knowledge, the spells of the Book of the Dead. But the living were not safe. Demons were not confined to the afterlife. They could also pass freely into the land of the living, where they could either help human beings or wreak untold harm.
So we call them like certain powers, and they have huge effect, which can affect our life. It affects the dead, it affects the life, it affects in a good way and in a bad way.
Ancient Egyptians believed that demons caused everyday illnesses such as headaches. But there were magical spells to help them fight these malevolent creatures.
Then when there is illness, certain illness caused by a certain demon, the spell, magical spell, will try to drive away the influence of this demon. There was no kind of separation between magic, religion, and medicine in ancient Egypt.
There were also good demons who could help humans in life-threatening situations.
The most dangerous time was childbirth. There was a high child mortality rate, and it was considered to be a very dangerous time for mother and for child. And that's why you have these grotesque demons or creatures protecting the mother at childbirth, like Bes and Taweret.
Demon magic is a powerful instance of overlap between worlds of the living and the dead. But it is not the only one. As the deceased continued their journey, they moved inevitably towards a critical event. The final approach is powerfully revealed on the walls of another newly opened Egyptian tomb. On the west bank of the Nile, opposite Luxor, lies another sacred site. The tomb of Roy, an Egyptian scribe who lived around 1300 BC. The small size of the tomb is offset by the beauty and clarity of the paintings on its walls. The vivid scenes follow one another like an ancient comic strip. Here, Roy and his wife have passed through one of the gates of the afterlife. In the next scene, the god Horus leads them towards an event that would decide their fate once and for all, a final judgment. Before judgment, the deceased made what was known as the negative confession, listing the many mortal sins he had not committed, such as causing hunger, inflicting pain, or committing murder.
It's possible that some of the negative confession was used as a moral guidebook. So as opposed to the commandments, what you shall do, shall not do, it's I have not done murder, I have not stolen from the temple, I have not committed a sexual misdeed. So through chapter 125 of the Book of the Dead and the negative confession, we get a sense of the Egyptians' own code of morality.
After this extraordinary declaration came the judgment itself. But the deceased might not have to face this test alone. Images on some tomb walls show a husband and wife approaching it side by side. This moment of truth would decide if they would have a happy existence or be consigned to oblivion. It was known as the weighing of the heart.
The weighing of the heart in the afterlife is the point where the gods determine whether this person was a supporter of Ma'at, supported the proper order of the cosmos or not.
The weighing of the heart is the centerpiece of the Book of the Dead. In this deadly ritual, the heart of the deceased is weighed against a feather, symbolizing truth, order, and justice.
Here we have, an insight into the idea of the heart is also represents the will, and the people, they were born with free will or created with free will. So the heart is where it plays very important role, and the innocence, and the source of evil or source of goodness, is also related to the heart.
Ancient Egyptians saw the heart as the vessel of a person's life force, the essence of their being, and a record of their time on earth. If it was heavy with sin, the scales would drop and the heart would be devoured by Ammit, the soul eater, a terrifying creature with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the back legs of a hippopotamus.
If your heart does not maintain equilibrium with the feather of Ma'at, it, and of course you by implication, are tossed into the waiting gullet of a composite monster called Ammit, whose name means she who devours.
For a heart devoured by Ammit, there was no return. The dead would fade from memory, and the sum total of their existence would cancel out. Those who avoided this awful fate proceeded to a land known as the Field of Reeds. Here they would experience an ideal version of the life they had led before death, eating, drinking, and even working. The ancient Egyptians viewed the afterlife as a continuation of existence. Once the dead had passed all the tests and creatures of the underworld, they would be able to live on in an ideal version of their lives on earth. The blessed dead hoped to spend eternity in paradise with Osiris, the god of the underworld. This paradise was a group of islands covered in fields of rushes. It lay in the east where the sun rises, and it was called Aru, the Field of Reeds. Aru was believed to be the soul of the Nile Delta, Egypt at its best.
It seems to be Egypt in perpetual festival. You're constantly celebrating a festival, you're constantly at the banquet, you're always fishing and fowling and ritual hunting. The river level is always just right, never too high, never too low. So it's the great things about Egypt all together forever.
But in the afterlife, there is additional work to be done, agricultural work primarily.
The Egyptians recognized very early on that for the proper functioning of society, there has to be order, there has to be control, and with this, of course, inevitably comes taxes and tax work. So even in the netherworld, which the Egyptians appear to have hoped would be a good mirror of the world they knew in Egypt, you're going to have to work, and you're going to have to pay your taxes.
To carry out this work, the dead could make use of supernatural helpers. Ushabtis are by far the most common grave goods found in Egyptian tombs. These small figurines were intended to act as servants for the deceased in the afterlife.
The Egyptians believed the entire cosmos is permeated by a force they call Heka, that we call magic. And by harnessing that force, you can get these little Ushebti figures, these sort of little miniature personal golems to go out and do your bidding and your work.
At the end of the 19th century, archaeologists working on the west bank of the Nile discovered an extraordinarily beautiful and completely intact tomb. Untouched for thousands of years, it contains some of the most lavish paintings found in any Egyptian sacred site. The Field of Reeds is exquisitely depicted here. The tomb belonged to a man named Senedjem. He and his wife, Nefertiti, lived around 1280 BC, during the prosperous New Kingdom era.
The tomb of Senedjem is an amazing tomb. For one thing, it was one of the earliest discovered in the Theban necropolis. In the tomb of Senedjem, up to 20 individuals were buried, 9 of whom in coffins with names, and we know that they were members of Senedjem's family.
Senedjem had a prestigious and highly skilled profession.
Senedjem was the artist responsible for 2 major tombs in the Valley of the Kings. the tomb of Seti I and Ramses II. It was a good time to be an artist, to work on these funerary monuments.
To decorate the tomb walls, Senedjem used paint made from water, gum, and ground pigments. This was highly prestigious work.
Artists were very important in Egyptian culture. Scribes and artists worked very closely together. Often Egyptologists would talk about artisans rather than artists because they worked in teams and they never signed their work. But the quality of their work speaks for itself. They are definitely high-quality artists.
The images on the walls of Senedjem's own tomb evoke his hopes of proceeding to a tranquil afterlife existence. An entire wall is covered with scenes from the Field of Reeds. Surrounded by blue water, the land is rich with crops, trees, poppies, and cornflowers. And yet there is something deeply personal and disarmingly human about these images. The man and woman harvesting their crops are Senedjem and his wife. In another scene, the couple are worshiping Re and Osiris, followed by a boy on a papyrus boat, who is most likely their son. Here, life and death remain connected, each one an echo of the other. The door of Senedjem's burial chamber is preserved at the Egyptian Museum. It shows the artist and his wife playing Senet, an ancient board game. They did not simply play for amusement. Senet offered a direct spiritual connection to the world of the dead, and through it, the dead could influence the living.
The coffin texts and the Book of the Dead refer to the Senet game as a way in which the living and the dead can communicate. When you play it, you go through the netherworld. But if you play it during a festival, the souls of the dead, in whose tomb chapels you may actually be playing, can influence the moves of the living in the game, and thereby create a sort of synergy between the other world and this world.
The complex relationship between the living and the dead survived long after burial. Every year at a celebration known as the Beautiful Festival of the Valley, families undertook a joyful procession to the cemeteries of their ancestors. They wanted to communicate with their departed relatives because the dead had become powerful in the afterlife. The devotees placed bowls filled with offerings at the tombs, along with messages, letters to their deceased relatives, asking how they were faring in the underworld.
The separation between the world of the dead and the world of the living is not as we have here. People were writing letters to the dead ancestors and family members who died and asking them for help and solution in some of their social problems, business problems. So there was lots of interaction, good things or bad things happening also by influence of these forces of the spirits of their relatives or the dead.
Ancient Egyptians believed that their ancestors could either help or harm them. Like demons, they could play an active role on Earth.
Letters of the dead indicate that, because we have a letter written by a man to his wife from the Old Kingdom saying, haven't I been good to you? Haven't I been faithful to you? Haven't I put food in your belly and oil on your back? Now, why are you sending this disease? Please take it and go away. So in some sense, that letter indicates that he thought that his wife, as now a demon, is causing him to be ill.
For ancient Egyptians, life and death existed side by side as part of one cosmic whole. This worldview is very different from modern-day Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. Its origins have never been fully explained. But a little-known artifact in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo could point to the answer. The museum is known for its remarkable collection of coffins. One of these, hidden away on an upper floor, is often overlooked. It belonged to an Egyptian general called Sepi, who died around 1850 BC. The coffin's wooden panels are illustrated with hieroglyphs and images. They are a prototype version of the Book of the Dead, centuries before the book came into regular use. Painted in bright colors, these are the spells and sacred knowledge that Sepi needed to survive the afterlife.
The coffin of Sepi in Cairo Museum used to be the best example because it has lots of beautiful illustrations. And we have other examples in several other museums, but they never reached this high quality of inclusion of iconography of living creatures.
Many of the gods and demons depicted here later featured in the Book of the Dead, such as the god Osiris. Surrounded by circles that symbolize fire, he holds a scepter of power in one hand and an ankh, the symbol of life, in the other. But these images are more than just a precursor to later concepts of the afterlife. They are also the key to a remarkable new discovery. In 2015, Egyptologist Wael Sherbini announced that he had unearthed a long-forgotten artifact at the Cairo Museum, a rolled-up leather manuscript, over 8 feet long. Produced over 4,000 years ago, it is the longest and oldest Egyptian leather manuscript yet discovered.
The moment I saw the text and the script itself and things, I couldn't believe that this is true.
Like the Book of the Dead, this extraordinary manuscript contains spells and images of supernatural creatures. But despite the similarities, it is not a Book of the Dead. The rituals it describes have nothing to do with the afterlife. They took place in the real world, in a temple, not a tomb. Leather documents like this are astonishingly rare. Almost none have survived because leather deteriorates rapidly when exposed to the elements. The manuscript discovered by Dr. Sherbini only survived because somehow it was kept in safe storage.
We never had anything in hand, simply because the weather in Egypt cannot make these things survive. Number two, they were already mainly in temples or with priests or kept in archives and certain, and these things were not in cemetery.
The manuscript is in a highly fragile condition, broken into fragments. It is extremely brittle and vulnerable to damage. Because of this, it cannot yet be filmed.
The piece was in very bad condition. This is a very unique piece. Scientifically, it was difficult to treat because mostly we are used to papyrus. But for leather, that was very difficult.
After a painstaking analysis of the fragments, Dr. Sherbini managed to reconstruct some of the text on paper. What he discovered was breathtaking. The leather manuscript was used in special temple rituals that had nothing to do with death or the afterlife. But many years later, these temple rituals were adapted for use in the afterlife. They are the real-world origins of the Book of the Dead. Dr. Sherbini found proof of this on Sepi's coffin in the Cairo Museum. The leather manuscript was produced centuries before the coffin, but some of the spells and creatures depicted on the manuscript were exactly reproduced on the coffin.
Here, for the first time, we have color illustrations of these creatures exactly as we find in Sepi, and sometimes even some places even better. So we have another version, and this points us to, it opens for us like a new gate.
Originally, these spells allowed the user to access restricted areas in a temple. But on the coffin, they are intended for the afterlife, to allow the dead to pass through the gates of the underworld. The Book of the Temple had evolved into the Book of the Dead. This remarkable discovery could overthrow centuries of Egyptology. It shows that the spells of the Book of the Dead were originally used for the living. These living rituals still resonate in one of Egypt's best-preserved sacred sites. A short distance north of Luxor lies the Dandara Temple Complex, dedicated to Hathor, the goddess of women, love, and fertility. The superb decorations on the temple ceiling show the journeys of the gods through the heavens. But these images also evoke the journeys and experiences that Egyptians faced in their everyday lives. The present structure dates from around 100 BC, but there was an earlier sanctuary here as far back as 2600 BC, only a few centuries before the leather manuscript was written. The manuscript describes the kind of sacred ceremonies that would have taken place here. This is fascinating evidence of the religion the Egyptians practiced 4,000 years ago, in their homes and in their temples. Until now, Egyptologists knew little about this long-forgotten religion.
All these were lost, and we only were left with funerary material. But now, for the first time, we see that we have evidence.
In the temple, there were certain rooms where unlawful intrusion could cost the trespasser his life. The temple priests believed that the gods dwelt in these forbidden rooms, and that they were watched by supernatural guardians, such as these impassive demons, armed with great knives. But it was not these imaginary demons who killed intruders, but the temple's own human guards. Sometimes they even burnt the offender's body, so that his soul could not survive in the afterlife. In order to safely access the restricted areas, Egyptian priests needed special knowledge, spells, or secret codes. The leather manuscript contained the information needed for this purpose.
The leather roll gives us assurance that we have most of the spells, which were already in funerary context, had already an origin in rituals happening in real life.
The leather manuscript was used in temple rituals that reflected the everyday lives of ordinary Egyptians. The manuscript was later adapted for use in the afterlife. This is why the journey through the afterlife involves passing through gates and interacting with gods and demons. And it could be why so many afterlife concepts and rituals originate in real-world experiences. Many of these rituals were rooted in the physical world, from mummification and the opening of the mouth to the great festivals of Opet and the Valley. So too was the belief that ancestors and demons could affect people's lives in real and tangible ways, in everything from playing a board game to protecting mother and baby during childbirth. But the afterlife beliefs involved more than simple ceremony. The Book of the Dead also embodied a moral code that was powerfully linked to life experience. This evokes a potent sense of wrong and right, and many of the values that human beings still hold dear in the present day.
The ancient Egyptians had a very high sense of morality. They valued the idea of intelligence, hard work, and perseverance, and considered them avenues to success.
When you do the right thing, when you maintain ma'at, when you keep a balance, you reproduce what the gods do. You separate out good and bad, right and wrong, and by doing that, you actually become a sort of divinity yourself.
As alien as the ancient Egyptian religion may seem to the modern mind, it embodies a basic morality that is surprisingly familiar. Ancient Egyptians did not consider people to be dead in the way that we do today. For them, the Book of the Dead could easily have been called the Book of the Living, because for them, the afterlife was nothing more and nothing less than an echo of the living world, an echo that resonates in their magnificent sacred sites, enduring monuments to life and death in ancient Egypt.